It's interesting, Tom, isn't it? That, I mean, it's understandable that the PM is going to want to focus on Ukraine. I imagine a lot of people watching are going to think, I wish you'd focus a bit more on the levelling up and the cost of living crisis.
Certainly there are lots of competing demands for this government, but this is a government that, of course, has been struck by crisis after crisis since it's won its historic majority back in 2019. It was only a few months before the country was struck by coronavirus and now, of course, war in Europe. It seems like this government just can't get a break. And yet, for this Prime Minister, speaking about the war does seem to be a bit of an advantage, moving the conversation on from those pandemic-related scandals that had bogged down his premiership for months beforehand. Indeed, the Prime Minister has been speaking to Ukrainian President Zelensky almost on a daily basis for the last few weeks now. He's seen as a relatively strong ally, and if you listen to the way that Zelensky spoke in the British Parliament compared, for example, to the German Bundestag, where he was more critical of German leadership over the last few months, it's easy to see why the government seems to think that Ukraine is a relatively strong card for Britain. But also there's more than that at this conference today. This is a party that's looking forward to the next 2 years, really. The chairman of the party, Oliver Dowden, this morning is opening the final day of conference by saying that they're really starting a 2-year election campaign, getting candidates in place, getting the messaging finalised and sorting up, revving up that election machine for an election they see as 2 years away.
A positive sort of energy, you think, in terms of moving forward, Tom, today at the conference. So, look, is that the feeling that you're getting? Basically, what I'm saying is from the Conservative Party there, they've got to move on from the pandemic, they've got to move through the Ukrainian war, and then they've got to move forward to look to the next election. Is that the focus?
That certainly is the hope of this conference. It is very interesting to see that this is a party that seems more optimistic than perhaps the polls would suggest. I mean, let's not forget the Conservatives are still several points behind in aggregate in the polls, although the Prime Minister's personal ratings have ticked up a little bit over the last few weeks. We're still living in a country where the Labour Party is in the lead, and yet you wouldn't think about that. You wouldn't feel that talking to activists at this conference. They're relatively buoyant. They feel their party is more united, and they're talking about the future. They're certainly talking about some of the challenges to come, but if you were listening to any of the speeches yesterday, for example, from the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, who I spoke to, he was talking about how the UK may become the biggest economy in Europe in future decades. If you spoke to Jacob Rees-Mogg, he was talking about how we're going to have this bonfire of EU regulation, about how the government is going to get on with a huge domestic agenda, revving up the economy and making people more wealthy in this country. There seems to be a huge amount of positivity, although, of course, whether that translates into the country or whether this is a party talking to itself is an open question.